If you would, open up to Matthew chapter 8. As we looked last week at the story beforehand, there's kind of an interesting contrast between the previous story that we looked at that took place in Capernaum, and then the next story that takes place, but what can sometimes be brought out is not intended. And I'll make what I'm saying a little bit more clearly as we go through these next couple of verses. Because if you remember in the story of this Roman centurion, that he came to Jesus with a great faith, even superior to anything Jesus had found in all of Israel. And his response was, Jesus, I recognize that you're a man who's also under authority and that you have authority. You don't have to come to my house. You just say the word and my servant who is sick will be made well. And Jesus marvels at this in terms of, here he is. Israel can't get this at this moment. They can't seem to grasp this type of faith that they should have. And yet here's someone who's a centurion, an outsider for sure in terms of not being a Jew or an Israelite. And he puts these things in front, and he talks about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were those who responded out of faith. He says, you respond like them. He says, you're going to get to share in the kingdom of heaven with them. He says, but if you're going to reject what I'm doing, you will be cast out into the outer darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then he tells the centurion, go. He says, this shall be done for you as you have believed. And the servant was healed that very moment. And the very next story you come to in verse 14 is still taking place in Capernaum. Matthew doesn't go as far out of his way to make sure you know that. Other gospel accounts do this. I'm always a little timid to draw from other gospel accounts whenever we're trying to study just one book in particular. But at the same time, sometimes you get extra details that are very pivotal. Other times you just get more details and they don't necessarily affect things. But looking at verse 14, it says, when Jesus came into Peter's home, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick in bed with a fever. So, if you haven't realized it yet, Peter's from Capernaum. This is where, if you know, of course, already that Peter, Andrew, James, and John are fishermen, so it would make perfect sense that they would live in a town like Capernaum, because Capernaum is right on the Sea of Galilee. And this is kind of their, if you want to think of their home waters, you can kind of think of it that way. The Sea of Galilee, just to try and give you a little bit of a mindset, is about the distance east to west, which is about a little bit less than 7.5 miles. To give you a Jeff City coordinates on that, if you could drive in a straight line between where we are right now and where Oscar's restaurant is over on the east side of town, that's about the distance from east to west the Sea of Galilee is. Just to give you a general idea, it's not really small, but it's not just humongous either. And however, from north to south of the Sea of Galilee is a little bit less than 13 miles, like 12.8 miles from top to bottom. So you get just a general idea. This is a big body of water. Capernaum sits on that body of water. And so here Peter is, this is his home, and notice who lives with him. His mother-in-law. So what does that tell you a little bit about Peter? He's married. You know that for sure. I always tell the same thing, I know. But you look at this and you go, all right. He said, Jesus sees his mother-in-law lying sick in bed with a fever. And then verse 15 says, he touched her hand and the fever left her. And she got up and waited on him. What seems kind of unique about verses 14 and 15 compared to the story with the centurion? Yeah, it seems like nobody asked anything, and he doesn't even seemingly say a word in this one, so that's even different than the story of the centurion. The search like, you know what, you don't have to come, you just say the word. You come to this story, and it's like, you don't even have to be asked, and you don't even have to say a word, he just touches her.
Walks in and finds her there standing.
Now, Here's where, once again, I'm going to tell you we got to be careful, because that is not the idea in this story. Because if you look over at the Gospel of Luke, you will see parallels there where it describes her as having not just a fever, but a high fever. Of course, Luke is giving you a little bit more medical terminology. And at the same time, it says that Jesus rebuked this fever and it came out of her. So realize sometimes we want to put things in here and go, well, look at the contrast of these two stories, but that's not really Matthew's point. What's he really trying to impress upon us? His power, the power of Jesus, in terms of going, here it is, right here in Peter's own home. His mother-in-law lives with him, and he sees that she's lying in bed, sick with a fever, and all he does is touch her hand. Typically, when we hear fever, what do we think of is a problem? Virus, infection, we think of things along those lines. And I just want you to take this moment. When you think about somebody who's got a virus or an infection, I mean, it's all the way down to individual cells being affected with viruses and bacteria, and to think, here's Jesus, who just here in this story just touches her hand, and he can change us on the molecular level. Now just think about that. We can't even change us on the molecular level. I mean, when you go to the doctor with a fever or an infection, they don't go, well, let me just touch you, and then you'll be fine. Can I just touch your hand? I mean, that'd be the parallel. And at best, what do they typically do? They go, if it's a virus, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do for you. Go home and drink a lot of liquids, and hopefully you can flush that thing out of your system. If it's, maybe an infection, they go, all right, here's some antibiotics. You go take these, maybe 7, 10, 14 days, and then, after a giving of time, you'll be well. Notice how immediate this is. And I just want you to see and just stand amazed at the power of Jesus to work on such a small, minute level and to heal the problem instantly. And then notice too, here she is. He says, he touched her hand and the fever left her. And she doesn't just go, okay, I need a few minutes to catch myself. Immediately, what happens? She gets up to serve. What a wonderful mother-in-law. Now, you stop to look at this and you go, her response isn't, oh, Jesus made me well. That's great for me. She goes, you've made me well. Now it's my time to serve. And to be able to wait on Jesus, to wait on Peter, to wait on others. Rita.
I think this was such a loving thing for Jesus, too, because, as Peter's wife, we don't know much or anything.
Anything.
But, with Peter being gone quite a bit following Jesus, everything was pretty much left to her in the home and stuff. And so for Jesus just to have that, I'm going to make it a little bit easier for you, my dear. And I just think it's such a loving thing for him to do.
Right. You see him take care of what's going on at hand. I'll give you another detail that you don't get here in Matthew. You get this one from over in Mark chapter 1. Jesus had already been to the synagogue this morning, the same day of the Sabbath, when you read the story over in Mark. And he's taught in the synagogue there in Capernaum. So basically like the home synagogue of Peter, Andrew, James, and John. And he's cast out an unclean spirit. Can you imagine having that happen in a religious service, in the synagogue service on the Sabbath? And after they come out, that's whenever Jesus comes to the home of Peter. Because I'm telling you that because of this next little detail. Look at verse 16. When evening came, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were ill. You see that little phrase where it says, when evening came? Why does it want to give you the time of day? Not necessarily in the morning. I want you to think about it. It's the Sabbath. So when are they free to move? At sunset, right? Now, I'm going to tell you, this little detail eluded me for over 40 years. And yet, in Mark's account, whenever you read through this whole story, it tells you all these different things that happened in Capernaum in terms of what happened in the synagogue that morning, what happens at Peter's house with his mother-in-law, and then it gives you just a little more detail, and then it says, and when evening came, it almost sounds like, and all these people came out of the woodwork to come to Jesus, to be healed. And you realize in Mark's account, you kind of get it a little bit more because you imagine being at the synagogue worship service on the Sabbath, and somebody actually has an unclean spirit cast out of them and proclaiming about who Jesus is, and then they go, well, we can't travel that far to Peter's house. We can go home, and whenever the sun sets, we're going to make a mad dash to get over there to make sure that we see Jesus. So, like I said, you don't get those details here in Matthew's, but I just want you to know, sometimes these little phrases, we look at that and we go, okay, it's just a time of day thing. There's reason. And the reason is, these are a bunch of Jewish people who want to keep the Sabbath because they're under the old covenant. And they're not looking to just throw away the old covenant in seeking Jesus. And they're doing exactly what they should have done. Then, he says, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed. Why specifically demon-possessed? What had they seen at the synagogue that morning? Or in the morning of the previous day, let's put it that way. They had seen him have this authority and power. And that's one of the things they actually say in Mark 1. He says, look at this man. He teaches with authority and he has power. Wow. Then, here's the other aspect. And he cast out the spirits with a word. Did you catch that? Does he have to say, all right, and I want you to think of the stupidity of sorcery. And they want to talk about, boy, you have to conjure up all these words and all these things. And you go, that is not what power is. That is the most evil, false kind of things. Here's Jesus. He casts out the spirits with a word. And then the next aspect is, and healed all who were ill. Which word sticks out to you? All. There was no one who came to Jesus out of faith at that time that he did not heal. And you just imagine what that does for PR work. All of a sudden, everybody who had an unclean spirit that came was healed. Anybody who was sick got there. They were healed. I mean, can you imagine? I know this is bringing this to a place that probably shouldn't be. But can you imagine if we had even just one hospital in the world where every single patient that ever came there walked away 100% healed? And how long do you think there be a line to get into that place? And how much do you think the airlines could charge for a plane ticket to get to that place? And how much do you think they could charge for a hotel to stay there for the night before or the night after? Yet, is that Jesus' purpose in any of these things? The one thing that you notice is there any money passing hands? Is Jesus doing this for any kind of monetary gain? No, none whatsoever. And so, you see what's at hand here. And then, Matthew now wants us to know this is exactly the way it's supposed to be. And you should know this from the Old Testament. Because verse 17, he says, this was to fulfill what was spoken through Isaiah the prophet. He himself took our infirmities and carried away our diseases. And of course, this is a quotation out of Isaiah 53, which, as you very well know, if you start reading through Isaiah 53 after you've been exposed to the life of Jesus, all you see is just, well, this is another prophecy about Jesus. But he's going to suffer and he's going to die. This is a prophecy about, look, he's going to be pierced through. Here's a suffering in terms of going to be buried with the rich. Here's about it. You just look at one thing after another, that the Lord's going to be pleased with him offering himself as a sacrifice. All those things together. But at this point in time, the Spirit of God through Matthew wants us to catch. You need to make the association that Jesus is my servant and that he's going to fulfill everything that has been prophesied about him. And the one thing that we may look at and go, you know, he himself, notice how personal it makes it. He himself took our infirmities, he says, and carried away our diseases. Wow. On them. Right, in terms of, it talks about in verse 16 you're talking about. It says, and he cast out the spirits and healed them, healed all who were ill. Is that the part? Put his hand on them? Right, similar idea. And so, if you notice in 17, he did it himself, which makes it very personal. And you know the difference between something being just general and something being personal when it comes to your care. Juanita? We'll get there. Boy, you're just running right on ahead of us. Hopefully we'll get to the end of chapter 8 and we'll see that exact thing. Right. They went where Jesus told them to go. That's where they went. Now, notice how this continues on. And this is kind of a smaller detail. Look at verse 18. Now, when Jesus saw a crowd around him, what is taking place? People are gathering. Now keep in mind, he's in Capernaum. This is a waterfront city. And so all of a sudden, as he is healing people, casting out demons, everybody, this is just my mental image because of a certain scene I remember seeing at an old community schoolhouse where we kind of have a place like this in our own building where there's a bunch of walkers and wheelchairs and canes and pumps and braces for joints and things like that. And my picture of this in a present-day world is there are people who are coming up to Jesus who are needing all kinds of things. And yet, whenever they leave, they don't need any of it. I mean, can you just imagine at your own house, do you have any medical equipment there? Some of you are going, a whole storehouse room full. Some people are like, no, I haven't gotten to that point yet, and I don't want to get there in a hurry. But to see the scene back there, and keep in mind, it's not as if the medical care back then is with x-rays and MRIs and blood tests and blood draws and things like that. To go for somebody who can come in and do these things, this is mind-boggling. So when all this crowd gathers around in verse 18, he says, now when Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to depart to the other side of the sea. How does he feel about this big old crowd? Let's get away. I hope this reminds you, look back at Matthew chapter 5, verse 1. You'll notice this very peculiar attitude Jesus has. Chapter 5, verse 1. When Jesus saw the crowds, plural, he went up on the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. So what does Jesus see first? All these big crowds. He go, okay, well, let me go to where they are. He's like, I'm going on the mountain. And if you really want to know, you'll follow. I'm not here to come to you. Now, come back over here to Matthew chapter 8. You see this same mindset, which is really counterintuitive to the way people typically operate now. They see a big crowd and they go, well, I wonder what I can do to be there and get what I want from them. Jesus is looking for a response from people. And so he heals that person with an unclean spirit in the synagogue in Capernaum. Then you see this response out of all these people who have just heard. Perhaps some of them had family members who were in the synagogue. It doesn't really bring those details out. And they go, I've got to take you to Jesus. He can make you well. And so here's Jesus. He's made all these people clean, cast out spirits. He's taking their infirmities and carrying away their diseases. And all of a sudden, he's getting so many people around him. And his response is to give orders to depart to go to the other side of the sea. He says, let's go. And Capernaum doesn't sit on the farthest west side of the Sea of Galilee. So Capernaum kind of sits, if you can kind of imagine the Sea of Galilee looking kind of like this, that Capernaum sits here, and they're going to go to the other side of the sea, which is about 4.5 miles away, just as an estimate. And once again, if you want a Jeff City measurement, if you could fly like a bird, you could go in a straight line from here to the Missouri State Capitol building. That'd be about 4.5 miles. To go, here they are moving and going, okay, and he gives orders. He doesn't say, all right, men, you think it's time to go? He gives them orders. He says to depart to the other side of the sea, other side of the Sea of Galilee. Now, I'm going to point out a detail before we really get there because I want you to see the point. Look down at verse 23. When he, talking about Jesus, got into the boat, what happened? I thought he gave them orders. Are they kind of slow on this? Are we ever slow on this? But I just want you to see where these disciples are. And you realize that the 12 are with him. And going, he gave them orders to go to the other side to depart to the other side of the sea, and they're still just standing there. And they don't get on the boat until when? Till he does. You ever had that? All right, I know. Young children, go get in the car. Time to leave. And then somehow you get there before they do. So we understand this, and we know probably we were on the child side of that at one point in time. So we understand. Well, yeah, but is he going to talk a little bit longer to somebody else? Just notice, and so in between loading up the boat, you get these two different little statements. One's going to be from a scribe, and one's going to be from a disciple. And so in the midst of trying to load up the boat, or get the disciples to get on the boat, which they're lagging behind in doing, now look back at verse 19. Then a scribe came and said to him, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Now, here's Jesus, all the things he's done in Capernaum. Jesus wants to leave to go to the other side of the sea, over on the east side. And a scribe comes up. In general, what do you know about the spiritual state of scribes? They copy all the law. They copy down the Old Testament books. They would actually be hired out even by government officials to copy laws, to make copies for other places to go, a little before the Xerox machine. And so at the same time, here's this scribe. I wonder if this scribe had ever copied down Isaiah 53. It's just a wondering. I mean, no way of knowing. But thinking through these things, whatever Jesus is doing, how has it affected this scribe? I want to be wherever you are. And so he says, "Teacher," which tells you, I'm willing to learn if you're willing to teach me. He says, "I will follow you wherever you go." Notice he doesn't have a question mark on the end of that. He says, teacher, I'll follow you wherever you go. You almost wonder if he didn't already maybe have one foot in the boat. I know it doesn't say that. But he says, I'll follow you wherever you go. What would you expect Jesus' response to be to a statement like that? Come and follow me. Get on. Maybe you can be the first one on the boat. These disciples aren't doing a great job. But notice that's not what Jesus says. He doesn't say necessarily what we would expect. And he says something perhaps we would never come up with, which is the reason why it's written down. Verse 20. Jesus said to him, the foxes have holes, and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. What gets communicated in that statement? He's exhausted. He's tired. We'll see that here in a minute. I mean, you realize you have it kind of nice now, because scribes made good money. I mean, just to give you a general idea of a scribe, how much on your page do you think they or how many chapters do you think they had to copy for a day's wage? Just take a wild guess. How many pages of text do you think they would have to handle within what you're looking at in your Bible? Right. Right. And not only do you have to copy it, you have to have an original, you have to make what you're writing on, you have to make what you're writing with, and if you can always use your fingers to know how much a day's wage for a scribe is. You had to copy this much text. You can fit it, just take your fingers like that, and you can know. Just that much was a day's wage. You think scribes did okay monetarily? Now, granted, there's a lot that goes into that. So here's a scribe. Jesus says, you know what? You have kind of a nice life right now. And he's not saying spiritually, but he's saying if you're going to follow me, why do foxes go in holes? Weather, protection, to sleep. I mean, specifically sleep's the aspect. But you realize that's where they kind of have a place where they can be protected and to kind of fall back. Then he says, and the birds of the air have nests. I mean, have you ever noticed whenever birds are skittish, what direction do they go? They go up. If you ever seen a bird trapped inside of a room, the problem is the bird just keeps on going up and hitting its head on the ceiling. Because it's like, usually I can do this and I can get out of here. But realize there's no place to go where you can just retreat. He says, and you need to know that. He says, the foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests. He says, but the Son of Man, talking about himself, has nowhere to lay his head. He says, are you sure you're ready for this? It's great to be gung-ho, but whenever things really start happening, you're still going to think the same way. And it doesn't tell you anything more about that conversation. It doesn't say, and the scribe changed his mind. It doesn't say, and the scribe was even more eager to be with Jesus. What does Matthew want us to do at this point? Are you ready to look on the inside of you? Do you really want him to be your teacher? Do you know it doesn't always come with rest? It doesn't always come at just hitting you whenever it's convenient. He says, what about you? He says, are you ready? I almost wonder if this doesn't get included by the Spirit through Matthew, of saying, Matthew trying to say, you need to look inside of you. How do you see Jesus? Then you come to another story, verse 21. Remember, what's Jesus trying to do at this point? Trying to get to the boat, trying to get his disciples to get on the boat. Verse 21. Another of the disciples said to him, Lord, permit me first to go and bury my father. Now, notice a disciple. It's not uncommon. The disciple would call their teacher Lord. I will obey you. I will submit to you. He says, Lord, I want to be with you. But what is he asking for? Will you grant me permission to go and bury my father? Now, I know for us, we see this and we think in terms of, okay, usually within, in our situations, usually within a few days. In some scenarios, maybe a week or two. I can think of a detail I heard about at a funeral home where someone was going to be buried at Arlington Cemetery, and they had to wait 6 months before that person could be buried. But that's a very different scenario. But understand this, we think in terms of, okay, 3 to 7 days, maybe 10 at the most, waiting on family to come in. This is different. You remember whenever Jesus is buried? Remember what the women do on Sunday morning? What do they bring out? Spices. To do what with? To anoint the body of Jesus. And, of course, they find a marvelous surprise. He's been raised from the dead. However, the burial process in Jewish thinking was not something that just took 3 days or 7 days. I mean, you went back really over the course of perhaps a month or more to put spices on the body so that whenever it decayed, it wouldn't smell. You're going to keep the bones. They're going to be put in a bone box once all the flesh is off of there. I mean, it's a long process. I mean, and really gut-wrenching in terms of a lot of things. And so whenever he asks this and says, follow me and allow the dead to bury their own dead, in verse 22, he says, he makes a statement, Lord, permit me first to go and bury my father. Don't see that as, he just wants a couple days. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, it may take me a month or two. What's Jesus' response to that? You're going to wait a month or two for me? He says in verse 22, follow me. And allow the dead to bury their own dead. What's more important? Me. I'm more important than an honorable burial for your father. And really, when you consider that, it's not Jesus being heartless. He's saying, if you had to choose, and I mean, I want you to really think about this. If you had to choose between waiting another 2 months or another month to follow Jesus in dealing with a family medical issue, especially after death, doesn't all dedication need to be to Jesus? He'll have to raise his father from the dead. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? But see, Jesus' point, I want to make sure you understand the culture of the time so that you don't make some drastic application that's not fitting here. But to come through it and see, he says, follow me and allow the dead to bury their own dead. He says, you let them take care of themselves. You look down the road and you can see it both ways. If he is going to choose to follow Jesus, the things that he can learn, that he can share with his family, will be far above the value of burying his father when it comes to the spiritual things. Karen? The spiritual dead bury the physical dead. Yeah, that's right. So, you have something else to add, Susan? Right. Yeah, you think of a similarity. And don't see this as Jesus is against people being buried. Don't take that. I've seen some extreme things in my life, as you have too. So after these two conversations, as Jesus is trying to get to the boat, verse 23, when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. So, and once again, these are kind of these little details that if you're not really, looking for them, we might overlook them. And so when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. Verse 24, it's like, finally we can get here. Now, you think about for Peter, this is a moment of, okay, I know my mother-in-law's well. I know all's good there. I'm going to follow Jesus. And he says, and behold, there arose a great storm on the sea. Not a minor storm, not a medium storm, a great storm. He says, so the boat was being covered with the waves, but Jesus himself he found a place to lay his head. Right? Isn't that something? How it brings up one side and it tells you the other. Like, I don't have a place to lay my head. The next place I'm going to sleep is on that boat, and I'm trying to get there, and you're keeping me from getting there. No, he doesn't say that part. He's more loving than that. That may be our response at times when we get sick, which tells us we're focusing on the wrong person. But at the same time, to see these things and go, this great storm arose on the sea. A little bit of topography for you around the Sea of Galilee. The waters of Merom come down from the north. The river kind of forms from the ice caps or the snow-capped mountain of Mount Hermon. That's the highest place in all of Palestine. It's over 5,000 feet tall, or over 4,500 feet tall. And so as that water turns and comes down, as the snow melts off the mountain, it comes down, as well as some other springs that flow into the waters of Merom. And as they come down, they come into the Sea of Galilee. So there's kind of this cut-out valley where that water flows into the northern aspect of where the Sea of Galilee is. So you have one little funnel for air to come through, or wind. On the west side of the Sea of Galilee, I'll paint it your direction. On the west side of the Sea of Galilee that goes toward the Mediterranean Sea, there's also a break in the mountains. And so whenever the winds would funnel off of the Mediterranean Sea, they would come right through that funnel on the west side, hitting the sea. And then you have what would also be another kind of wind wave from the north that's coming down. And whenever those two meet, what does that do on the Sea of Galilee? Woo-wee, this is going to be a ride. I mean, this is a great storm. That's my assumption about how these things are coming together. But either way, we know this is a great storm on the sea. And it's so much that the boat's being covered by the waves. In other words, the waves are higher than the boat walls. So water's coming in and splashing over the sides of this boat. He says, how's Jesus doing? Jesus himself is asleep. And that should tell us a little something. Is he tired? He's exhausted. And you realize so often we think about Jesus, well, he's the Son of God. He is also robed in flesh. He got tired too. Sometimes we kind of give him these assumptions like, he really didn't have to go through this. Yeah, he did. He got tired. And you realize, here he is. You also wonder, is that another reason why he wanted to get away from what's going on in Capernaum? Big old crowds are coming, and he's just exhausted. And as soon as they get in the boat, it seems like he's asleep pretty quick. And then this great big old storm. You think about the 4.5 miles from Capernaum to get over to the other side of the sea. And in the midst of all this humongous storm comes up. And as this happens, notice this next aspect. Verse 25. And had any of these men been out on the sea before? Yeah, like 4 of them are fishermen, right? So it's not one of those things where like the first time we've ever done this. It's not like training a new driver and the first time a big rainstorm comes up, and you're going, all right, now here's what you need to do. It's like, no, these are some kind of things they've been through before, but this may be a little bit more of an extreme case than what they had been in before. Because notice what it says. Because notice how they feel about it, verse 25. And they came to him and woke him, saying, save us, Lord, we are perishing. I mean, they come to him and they woke him however they woke him. I mean, I think a wake or wake or come on. But in whatever way they wake him up, and immediately they say, save us, Lord, we're perishing. How bad's the storm in their eyes? If you don't do something, we're going to die. We're going to die here. And couldn't some of these men swim? By the way, if you want a biblical example of this, in John chapter 21, whenever after Jesus' resurrection, Peter and 6 others are out fishing, and whenever Peter hears that it's Jesus who's up on the shore, do you remember what he does? He jumps out of the boat into the sea to swim to Jesus because he doesn't want it to take as long as the boat's going to take. So you realize, could Peter swim? Yes. These other fishermen, I'm assuming, could as well. It'd be kind of crazy, wouldn't it, if they couldn't? So here they are seeing this humongous storm. It's so much that they're thinking, we're going to die here. We're going to die here in the Sea of Galilee. We are perishing. And I want you to think a little parallel for us. How many times whenever we pray do we think, this is it. I'm done. I can't do anything more. And there's Jesus saying, are you ready for me? Because I can change this whole situation. But I'm going to have to wait on you to respond. And I want you to notice how Jesus is going to carry out the rest of this conversation. Look at what's here. Verse 26. He said to them, why are you afraid, you men of little faith? Notice he doesn't just stand up and what? He doesn't just stand up and take care of the problem. He wakes up, and here's people who are thinking they're about ready to perish and to die. And Jesus says, why are you afraid? Yeah. Why are you afraid? Sure.
So could this be a teaching moment provided by God with the storm?
Yeah.
Knowing that this is an opportunity for Jesus to teach.
Oh, certainly. Certainly. Because, Job 37:13 talks about how God uses weather. He used it in terms of to maintain his earth. He used it in terms of keeping his covenant promises. You might be thinking in terms of, rain to grow vegetation and food. And then there's also the idea of going, and it's also for discipline. And you go, all three of those can be used.
And so that's why Jesus was so confident and faith that
Right. And he's having to trust by faith too. Now, what you see at hand, why are you afraid? The next time you get afraid, I hope you'll remember this, to ask yourself the question. Life is ever changing in terms of our earthly existence, right? People come into our lives, people leave our lives. Situations change in terms of, is there enough money for retirement? Is there not? What's going on here? All these different things. And whenever fear comes in, go ahead and ask yourself, why am I afraid? It's a good question to ask ourselves. We don't always like the scenarios we're in. And if fear starts to take us over, what does fear work in opposition to? Faith. You remember the Sermon on the Mount? Do not worry. Do not worry. Do not worry. You can't change 1 hour of your life. And now here they are. And what are they? They're worried. They're afraid. And what's Jesus saying? What's missing? Oh, he says, you have little faith. He doesn't say there's no faith. He says, when is your faith going to mature and trust me? Because whenever we get afraid, isn't that what we need to hear? Am I going to trust God in this situation? You know, I think about sometimes young teenage children who are in Christ, and a parent passes away, or both parents pass away. What do you think is natural inside of that child? What's going to happen to me? Fear comes in, and realize, what is it time to look at? Do you trust the same God that created you can sustain you? And to go, that's what's needed in the moment. Now, what I find so curious about this moment in time is Jesus makes them think about it. He doesn't calm the storm until after he's given them a chance to think. How many times do you think Jesus has waited to calm the storm in our lives until we take the moment to think, why am I afraid? And how am I going to respond? Am I going to respond in the same thinking of the scribe? I will follow you wherever you go. Or are we going to be more like the disciple who's saying, can I take care of some other things first? And you realize those conversations were still in the heads of these disciples. Whether those men were on the boat or not, it doesn't say. But he says, why are you afraid, you men of little faith? Because what does faith do to the situation? It covers it, right? Now here's the thing. He says, you have little faith, because they had enough faith to do what? To wake Jesus up. But now they're going, oh, what now? What now? We're perishing. He says, you men of little faith. He says, then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and it became perfectly calm. And I want to emphasize the word that's there. Perfectly calm. You want to know what happens in any situation of fear when you turn to faith? What do you find? You find calm. You find peace. But until there's faith engaged, what never comes? You never find the peace. There has to be a reliance upon who God is, who Jesus is, what he commands. Is there a faith response here? And then even though the situation is not over, you find peace. Now here it is, and also another reality. In the mindset of the fever of Peter's mother-in-law being taken away, and Jesus working on a nano type of cellular, molecular biology type of things. Now what are you seeing him working on? He says, and I can control all of creation. I can shut down winds. Now you tell me if man's ever had an ability to do that. To shut down winds. To stop the storm. I want you to think about our own earthly existences. Whenever high winds come around and they start to circulate, the best thing that we can do, you can turn on the TV and they can tell you it's coming. They don't ever say, and here's when we'll stop it. Right? Which tells us, this is the God we have to serve. And I say have in the sense of, this is the only option in terms of something that's beneficial. This is the God we get to serve. What better Lord? What better God? And yet in the moment, he says, he rebukes the winds and the sea, and it became perfectly calm. And you think about, and now the sea that was so troubled now becomes perfectly calm. You ever tried to calm the ripples on water? What do you typically just have to do? Just wait for it. It'll subside. Yet here's Jesus. It became perfectly calm. Now, hold on. Rita? She had her hand up first. Sorry, Carey.
Well, I do think sometimes with Carey, we do ask, how long, O Lord? When you have a particular situation in your life where it's righteous versus evil, and after so much time, so much prayer, just like in Revelation, sometimes we ask, how long, O Lord? But he's there to say, it's in my time. And we know that. But I do think sometimes as humans, we say, how long, O Lord?
Right, and you realize at the same time, you can ask that question in multiple ways. Because it can be, I'm responding out of faith, how long do I have to endure this? And there's another side that says, I don't want to have to endure this, and I don't have faith in you, how long am I going to have to do this? And so like in Revelation, whenever those souls that are underneath the altar are saying, how long, O Lord, holy and true, until you avenge our blood, they go, how long is it going to be? We know you're going to do it. And they're looking from a after-death perspective back on the justice of God. And so here we are of looking at those things. Have we realized yet we need the storms? Have we come to that conclusion in life of going, I need the difficulties? They are good for me. They help refine me. And so it kind of keeps us stayed away from that question of how long do I have to go through this, as opposed to going, Lord, I know you'll strengthen me all the way through the end, because that's who you are. And it changes the perspective, doesn't it? Karen. Right. You see, I'm at the helm of this whole situation, of what God's granted me. And you think through these things too, of here's Jesus. He's tired. And whenever you're tired, do you like to be woken up to deal with a problem? No. Yet, what is he working off of? Is he still being spiritually minded to lead? Is he concerned about the faith of these men, of it maturing and growing? Yeah. Susan.
I think he was perplexed. I think he thought they should have known him better. Why are you so afraid? Don't you know who I am?
And you realize all of a sudden things are getting exposed on a bigger level, right? I mean, it's one thing to heal a woman's fever. It's another thing to go, oh, we're casting out demons. Does that translate to weather? And I want you to notice the response in verse 27. He says, the men were amazed. And I have a great English word for that. They were flabbergasted. I mean, what has happened? And now all of a sudden, Jesus is telling them, don't you realize what I can take care of? Think about that for us. How long does it take us to realize what God can take care of in our lives? Like our whole life, right? The things, and it's something I think about striving to be faithful in Christ for 10 or 15 or 20 years. And then you start looking back and you start to see, look at where he took care of us even despite ourselves. Look at how he took care of us even in our faults, as he was being patient for us to really turn to him. And then to go, you can see it looking back, but for some reason we have a hard time seeing it forward for today. And so in looking through this, if you see what's here, he says, the men were amazed and said, what kind of a man is this? They're looking at him as He's not a kind that's like us. He's different. None of us can do that. He says that even the winds and the sea obey him. Now lock in on that word for a second. The winds and the sea obey him. Didn't Jesus tell them to get on the boat? I mean, back in verse 18, he gave orders to depart to the other side of the sea. And yet, what didn't happen? They didn't until Jesus got on the boat. The wind and the sea is more obedient to Jesus than you and me, than they were. Do we see the power of the hand of Jesus? And to see the wind and the sea obey him, the molecules and the atoms inside of Peter's mother-in-law obeyed him. The unclean spirits obeyed him. What about me? Spirits don't have salvation in terms of the unclean spirits. The winds and the waves are all going to be destroyed in the end. What about me?
And they saw all this that he did before. So why, when they were in the boat, they lost their faith? Well, I guess.
It's little. It's little.
Just a little. They lost.
You're just a little faith. And to go,
They're seeing everything that he had done.
right. And you get a picture of these things together, and I hope it makes an impression on us. To go, am I as obedient as the wind? Am I as obedient as the sea? And we won't have time, but the next story that Juanita was getting to, you realize they're going to get over to the east side of the Sea of Galilee. Kind of in the Jewish thinking, they're going to get to the other side of the tracks, where things aren't always Jewish, and craziness is going to happen in their minds, and they're going to get a chance to really see Jesus even further. Karen?
Realize he has power, then they go along and they don't get it, even to the point all the way to the last hours of his life, where they all scattered.
Even when he's raised from the dead.
When he's raised from the dead and came back and talked to them, I think there's a point where it says in the scripture, and he opened their eyes for them.
He opened their mind, yeah, in Luke 24.
To understand the scriptures. It's like, really, all this time you didn't, you didn't get it, but we're.
And then we turn that mirror around and go, I've been in Christ for this many years, and how come I still don't get it that he can take care of everything in such a marvelous way? So next week we'll come back. We'll try and pick up here in verse 20.